All right, it's all about the facts, 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 facts. Okay, so a person like John Adams is both more interesting than I thought of and less interesting than I expected. So let's do it. Okay, so he was the first one-term president. He was not elected again, thus being a the first one-term president. John Adams was the second president of the United States. Everybody basically knows that. John Adams was not only the second president, he also was the second person to die on July 4th, the second president to die on this date, being that Thomas Jefferson was the first. His last words were ironically, Thomas Jefferson survives, which was incorrect because he actually died earlier than, you know, John Adams. So yeah, and also John Adams was the first VP. John Adams was a lawyer who defended the soldiers who shot at the people, the civilians in the Boston massacre. John Adams, of course, along with his son, was the only presidents of the first 12 that didn't own slaves, way before the Massachusetts miracle known as, um, what's his name? Mike Dukakis. John Adams was, of course, from Massachusetts, although his party affiliation would be comparatively conservative by today's standards, considering that he was a Federalist. He was the first president to run under a political party. As you know, George Washington was apolitical, but like George Washington, all his teeth fell out of his mouth. He had horrible trouble like that. John Adams had like horrible health. Like George Washington would bloodlet, but John Adams would like throw up, which really led to his teeth decay, sadly. John Adams, as president, the nation as a whole was like 4.9 million, which today's Massachusetts population is actually higher than when John Adams was in office. There, the population of Massachusetts is higher today. John Adams, of course, was the only one of the first five presidents not to be a Virginian. George Washington, at the age 15, stopped his formal education, while John Adams continued with his formal education, going to Harvard at the age of 15. None of John Adams' family members were at his inauguration. He was related to Samuel Adams, the founding father, who was named after the beer. When it came to the Massachusetts Constitution, he mainly wrote it along with Samuel Adams, his little cousin, Of course, when it came to like George Washington, he was called the father of the country. Well, John Adams was called the father of the American Revolution. So yeah, he's also a father. Speaking of fatherhood, him and his son both had feuds with presidents. John Adams had a feud with Thomas Jefferson. John Quincy Adams had a feud with Andrew Johnson. And here's an interesting fact: both John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams were on even numbers, 6 and 4 respectively, while their rivals were on 3 and 7, odd numbers. So that's pretty odd. When it came to being a father, John Adams is like one of two fathers to be fathers of presidents, if that makes sense. He was, of course, the father of John Quincy Adams, and of course, George Herbert Walker Bush, Deja Vu, was the father of George W. Bush. When it came to being a minister as in like ambassador, which that's what we called ambassadors at this time. John Adams was the first ambassador of Great Britain and the Netherlands. When it came to 1982, Ronald Reagan had a Dutch American Day, representative of how Dutch people helped us out, and he also mentioned John Adams' name. John Adams was a doting husband. He had thousands of letters exist today corresponding with his wife, while a person like George Washington only had three that survived to this day. So that suggests a lot. John Adams was the one who suggested George Washington be a general. John Adams was the one who created the what you call it, the Marine Corps. So that's pretty cool. John Adams was technically the first person to live in the current Washington D.C. Talk about living in Washington's shadow. John Adams was at George Washington was is on the $1 bill, so you would think that John Adams would be on the $2 bill, and he is. He's just on the back, while the third president, Thomas Jefferson, is on the $2 bill. The front. George Washington had at least four USS George Washingtons, while John Adams only had half that, too. John Adams is credited with keeping the country from fighting with France, which would pave the way to the Louisiana Purchase. Um, Although John Adams never owned slaves, he never voted against emancipation, within the borders of Massachusetts. So that kind of sucks. John Adams did write that all men are born free and equal, thus paving the way to civil rights and the emancipation of black people. So yeah, that's pretty cool. John Adams, speaking of black people, John Adams was the first and only country to recognize Haiti as a legit independent country at that time. John Adams arguably was the first obese president, they used to call him his rotundancy, and that was a senator from South Carolina who called him that, and in 1800 he lost South Carolina by at least 100 points. John Adams gave his swearing on his granddaughter's. Actually, John Adams owned a personal Bible, which he gave his granddaughter in 1814. John Adams was arguably one of the most important vice presidents. He voted in the Senate to break them at least 31 times. John Adams spent a night in the same bed with Benjamin Franklin. Talk about sleeping with your hundreds. Um, John Adams John Adams famously said a memorial will never be dedicated to me. He raised $2 billion to fund the American Revolution. John Adams raised his $2 billion as a ambassador to the Dutch. John Adams was the first lawyer president. It sounds like I was going to say loyal president. 24 to 27 presidents could be arguably called lawyers. John Adams looked up to George Washington and even had a grandson called George Washington Adams, who either killed himself or fell over and drowned, sadly. John Adams was the first fluent uh, bilingual president. While George Washington knew a few French words, John Adams knew French fluently. So, yeah, John Adams is the first president to have a name directly from the Bible, Adams, although he spells it with an S, so that's something significant. George Washington only went to one country out of the U.S., and that was Barbados, while John Adams went to at least four. John Adams was the first person. Um, John Adams was the first president not to wear pants. John Adams, most of the negative comments about Islam from John Adams was from his son, John Quincy Adams. Speaking of family, John Adams' father was a deacon. Also, Thomas Jefferson originally wanted John Adams to write the Declaration of Independence. In fact, originally both wanted each other to write the Declaration of Independence. Speaking of their relationship, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson shared at least 600 correspondent letters with each other. John Adams never directly deported any aliens in the Aliens and Sedition Act, although he definitely did use the sedition to like imprison people who he disagreed with, which left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Speaking of Benjamin Franklin, you know, the guy who he slept in the same bed with, he actually imprisoned Benjamin Franklin's grandson for speaking against him, so that was pretty great. All right, so John Adams' cousin Samuel Adams were one of the founders of the Sons of Liberty, and they were such a nuisance to the British that there was a bounty on John Hancock and Samuel Adams' head, and they wanted to negotiate with every American except those two. They had to die. George Washington used 2 vetoes, while John Adams used 0 vetoes. So that's very interesting. John Adams was the first president of the Senate, which is kind of the same thing as saying he's the first vice president, but that is still technically a separate fact. On to school shootings, or at least this time not a school shooting. John Adams loved hunting so much that he brought a gun to school. Luckily, he didn't shoot anybody. John Adams was the first of his family not to be a military officer. John Adams refused to work on the Sabbath day, which was pretty cool. John Adams convinced Thomas Jefferson to write the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He served as the uh, first American minister of the St. James in 1785. Although the Hamlin play does not have a character in it to portray John Adams, he is mentioned, of course, in the play. John Adams served as a diplomat for over 10 years. John Adams was the first vice president. John Adams, as the first vice president, did publish the Defense of the Government, which was like a volume work. And also, the Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest functional written constitution still this day. So that's pretty interesting. John Adams was a leading voice and very much praised by Thomas Jefferson. Um, John Adams named his nephew over the court in Washington, and he served for like 50 years, so that was pretty cool. John Adams did not believe in our formal believed in like a two-house system because he did not care for the tyranny of the majority. John Adams was one of 3 representatives to write the Treaty of Paris, one being John Jay and another his bed partner, Benjamin Franklin. John Adams formerly faced in the quasi war with France for like 2 years. John Adams created the Department of the Navy. Not only did he create the Marines, but he also created the Navy. That's very interesting. John Adams was heavily unseated by the guy on the $10 bill, Hamilton himself. John Adams had like 6 kids. That was very interesting. One of the kids suffered from like a rare illness. John Adams became a Unitarian after he really didn't care about Calvinism. John Adams donated like 3,000 books to a library. John Adams and his wife moved into the White House when it was unfinished. They even laid out the laundry to dry. Adams had his own historical park. Adams had a daily journal. Of course, that's how we know a bunch of stuff. He was known as a very quick tempered man. That's partially one of the reasons why he got the name. His rotundancy. A mutual friend of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson published their correspondence after they, tragically died. John Adams was a fan of like this basic meal called just baked beans and a loaf of Indian bread. John Adams and John Adams was deeply influenced by Greek and Roman authors. John Adams believed in educating the masses. That's what's pretty good. He also believed that everybody deserved a fair trial. That's why he defended the people who shot at the Boston Tea Party. John Adams served over 90 chairmen. John Adams' defense of the Boston massacre soldiers was seen as a bold move. John Adams had a motto that says truth in Latin. John Adams was a major fan of art and science. John Adams was a short man at 5'7". John Adams also coined the phrase a government of law and not of man. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson met in France. John Adams was so impressed with Europe, he called it a political demigods. John Adams believed that being the vice president was very insignificant. John Adams' favorite Roman writer was Cicero. Um, John Adams basically started what we call the Church of the Presidents. John Adams wrote that July 4th was going to be celebrated every year, you bet. Until recently, John Adams was the oldest president to live. He died at like 90 years old, only being surpassed by Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. All right, that's it.